The recreation center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as 37 folding chairs squeaked with nervous energy. Thomas sat in his usual spot, third row from the front, noting how Sarah Henderson had transformed their typically mundane HOA meeting space. A professional projector had replaced their old slide carousel, and glossy handouts with Riverside Commons letterhead were placed on each seat. The air felt thick with expensive perfume and uncertainty. As we move Oakwood Lane into the future, Sarah's voice carried across the room with practiced authority, her presentation remote clicking through rendered images of their street, transformed into what she called a vibrant community corridor. The before and after shots were particularly gut-wrenching. Their cherished private road reimagined with commercial-grade lighting, widened lanes, and, most horrifyingly, a projected traffic flow of up to 1,000 vehicles daily. Thomas's hand tightened around his pen as he watched his neighbor's reactions. Mr. Chen's usually peaceful face had turned to stone. Linda Matthews was furiously scribbling notes, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. But what caught his attention were the 4 unfamiliar faces seated in the front row, all nodding along enthusiastically to every point Sarah made. "Who are these people?" Thomas whispered to Linda. "Proxy vote holders," she whispered back, her lips tight. "Representing the Richardsons and the Patels who moved overseas. Sarah held private meetings with them last week." The betrayal hit Thomas like a physical blow. The Richardsons had been his friends for 15 years. They wouldn't have agreed to this, unless his suspicions were confirmed when Sarah smoothly transitioned to the community vote portion. "As per our bylaws, we've already secured 4 proxy votes in favor of the initiative," she announced, gesturing to the front row newcomers. "Combined with the board's majority support, we're pleased to announce that construction will begin next month." Thomas stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "This is procedurally incorrect," he stated, his years as a financial auditor evident in his tone. "Major infrastructure changes require a 75% majority and a 3-month review period." Sarah's smile never wavered as she clicked to her next slide, a legal document with highlighted text. "Actually, under Bylaw Amendment 5.3, passed in 1987, the board can expedite essential community improvements with a simple majority." She paused, her eyes locking with Thomas's. "I did my homework, Mr. McKinley." The room erupted into chaos. Mrs. Peterson, their eldest resident, was crying quietly in the corner. The Hendersons from number 23 were shouting about property values. But what chilled Thomas to his core was the satellite view on Sarah's next slide, their beloved Oakwood Lane, marked with construction zones. His own home clearly labeled as Phase 1 Impact Zone, with a small asterisk he couldn't quite read. Thomas McKinley's morning ritual began precisely at 6:45 am, when the first rays of sunlight would peek through his kitchen blinds. His worn leather slippers, a Christmas gift from his late wife Margaret 5 years ago, shuffled across the hardwood floors as he prepared his pour-over coffee with the precision of a chemist. The ceramic mug, also Margaret's choice, featured faded blue flowers that had survived countless dishwasher cycles and morning contemplations. By 7:00 am, he'd settle into the cushioned wicker chair on his front porch, where the view of Oakwood Lane stretched before him like a painting. The private road, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass comfortably, wound its way through a canopy of century-old oak trees that dappled the pavement with ever-shifting shadows. This was more than just a street. It was the heartbeat of their small community. Right on schedule, Linda Matthews and her golden retriever, Cooper, would begin their morning constitutional. Cooper had long ago learned to expect Thomas's hidden stash of premium dog treats, making their house an essential stop. Linda, a retired high school principal, would share the latest neighborhood news while Cooper enjoyed his snack. This morning, she lingered longer than usual. "Have you met the new HOA president?" Linda asked, her usual warm smile tightening slightly. Sarah Henderson moved into the Petersons' old place 3 months ago. Thomas hadn't, but he'd seen the moving trucks and noted how quickly the historic colonial had been stripped of its original shutters and repainted in what the younger residents called modern grage. He'd also noticed the steady stream of luxury cars visiting at odd hours, their occupants dressed more for downtown business meetings than suburban life. Mr. Chen, tending to his prized rose garden across the street, paused his meticulous pruning to join the conversation. His roses had won the county gardening competition 4 years running, their fragrance a signature of Oakwood Lane's spring mornings. She asked me very strange questions yesterday, he said, removing his gardening gloves, about easements and road width regulations. Said something about untapped community potential. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive click of heels on pavement. Sarah Henderson, power-dressed in a charcoal blazer despite the early hour, was walking their private road with a tablet in hand. She stopped every few yards to take photos and measurements, speaking rapidly into a Bluetooth earpiece about transformation opportunities and connectivity solutions. Thomas felt a familiar twist in his gut, the same sensation he'd experienced decades ago as a financial auditor when numbers didn't quite add up. He watched as Sarah paused in front of the street's private road sign, smirking slightly as she snapped a photo. His coffee, usually savored to the last drop, grew cold in his hands as he observed what felt distinctly like a predator sizing up its territory. Little did any of them know that this peaceful morning would be one of their last on the quiet, private road they called home. Linda Matthews hadn't practiced law in 15 years, but as she reviewed Thomas's evidence in her home office, her legal instincts blazed back to life. Spread across her dining room table lay a damning trail of documents. Sarah's undisclosed consulting contracts, surveillance footage time-stamped months before her HOA presidency, and most crucially, her signature on Riverside Commons preliminary plans dated well before she'd even purchased her home on Oakwood Lane. It's not just a conflict of interest, Linda explained to the gathered neighbors, her reading glasses perched on her nose. It's fraud. She deliberately concealed her relationship with the developers while using her position to facilitate their expansion plans. Thomas had organized the evidence with the same meticulous attention he'd once given to corporate audits. Each violation was color-coded, cross-referenced, and annotated with relevant HOA bylaw citations. Mr. Chen contributed his own evidence, photographs of Sarah measuring the street at night, weeks before announcing the community enhancement project. The media caught wind of the story when Mrs. Peterson's grandson, a junior reporter at the local newspaper, published a detailed exposé titled Paradise Paved: The Corruption of Oakwood Lane. The article went viral locally, especially the part about the ambulance delay during his grandmother's heart attack. Sarah's downfall came during an emergency HOA meeting that saw record attendance. As Linda methodically presented their findings, Sarah's composed facade cracked. She tried interrupting, then deflecting, then threatening legal action. But when Linda played the security footage showing her late-night meetings with developers, Sarah grabbed her designer handbag and bolted for the door. In a moment of poetic justice, she found her Mercedes blocked in by a delivery truck, using their street as a shortcut. The gathered residents watched through the recreation center windows as she sat trapped in her own creation, emergency flashes blinking helplessly. The new HOA board, elected unanimously the following week, moved swiftly. Linda, now president, worked with the city council to restore Oakwood Lane's private road status. Mr. Chen replanted his roses. May resumed her driving lessons, and Mrs. Peterson's afternoon card games once again had uninterrupted peace. Thomas installed a small plaque by the restored private road sign, reading Protected by Community Action, 2025. Below it, in smaller letters, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. The quote had been Margaret's favorite, and he smiled every morning, coffee in hand, knowing she would have been proud. Sarah Henderson sold her house 2 months later. Ironically, the property value had dropped significantly due to her own actions. The new owners, a young family with 2 children, were thoroughly vetted by the now vigilant community. They loved the quiet street, the friendly neighbors, and especially Mr. Chen's roses, which had somehow, despite everything, bloomed more beautifully than ever that spring. The first cracks in Sarah Henderson's community enhancement facade appeared at exactly 5:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when a semi-truck's GPS redirected it through Oakwood Lane, its air brakes screaming as it attempted to navigate the narrow turn. Thomas, already awake and documenting the street's transformation, watched as the truck's side mirror clipped Mr. Chen's cherished cherry blossom tree, sending pink petals raining down like tears. By week 3, their once peaceful sanctuary had morphed into a scene from a traffic controller's nightmare. Thomas maintained a detailed log on his laptop, which now read like a horror story. Monday, 7:30 am. School bus forced to reverse after meeting delivery truck head-on. Children late to school. Tuesday, 2:45 p.m. 4 cars using residents' driveways to make three-point turns. Wednesday, 11:20 p.m. Motorcycle group using street as unofficial racing strip. Thursday, 3:15 am. Drunk driver knocked over Linda's mailbox, fled scene. The Chen family's 17-year-old daughter May, who had been practicing for her driver's test on their quiet street for months, now refused to drive at all. Thomas watched from his porch as she barely jumped back from a speeding SUV that ignored the new stop sign, its driver too busy texting to notice the trembling teenager. That evening, Mr. Chen silently uprooted his county-famous roses, declaring the roadside too dangerous for gardening. The breaking point arrived during an unusually heavy rainstorm. Mrs. Peterson, their beloved 83-year-old neighbor, suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. The ambulance, arriving within minutes, found itself trapped in a gridlock of cars using Oakwood Lane to avoid highway construction. Thomas stood in the downpour, directing traffic with his umbrella, watching helplessly as precious minutes ticked by. Mrs. Peterson survived, thank goodness, but the incident left an indelible mark on the community's psyche. That same evening, while reviewing his security camera footage, Thomas noticed something peculiar. Sarah Henderson was giving an interview to the local news station, standing proudly in front of their street sign. This project exemplifies modern community planning, she boasted, gesturing to the chaos behind her. But what caught Thomas's eye was in the background, a man in an expensive suit, partially hidden behind a black SUV, watching Sarah with obvious familiarity. Thomas zoomed in, his auditor's instincts tingling. The man looked strikingly similar to James Morrison, the lead developer of Riverside Commons. The same James Morrison who, according to the Planning Commission's website, had submitted preliminary development plans months before Sarah even moved to Oakwood Lane. "Got you," Thomas whispered, reaching for his phone to call Linda. Their quiet street might have become a freeway, but Sarah Henderson was about to learn a crucial lesson. Never underestimate retired people with time, technology, and a thirst for justice.